The name Dracula often conjures images of twilight and dread, of a supernatural being lurking in the mists, a creature of fiction woven from the threads of fae. But what if the true chill, the genuine shiver, lies not in the supernatural, but in the stark, unvarnished truth of history? The figure behind this pervasive legend, Vlad III Drăculea, was not a creature of the night, but a prince of flesh and blood, a man who walked the brutal landscapes of 15th century Wallachia. Yet, in his stark reality, he was perhaps far more unsettling than any Gothic tale could imagine. A quiet contradiction sits at the heart of his story. How could a defender of his people become synonymous with monstrous cruelty? How does a historical figure, striving for the survival of his land, morph into a vampire of enduring myth? We won't chase phantoms tonight. Instead, we'll peel back the layers of fiction, gently, deliberately, to reveal the complex, often ruthless, and undeniably astute leader whose reign was carved out by relentless defense against the encroaching tide of the Ottoman Empire. This is the story of the quiet rhythms that shaped lives centuries ago, of a man forged in the crucible of his time, and the enduring echoes of his terrifying legacy. We invite you to listen deeply as we explore his life, his methods, and the historical currents that shaped him into one of history's most feared, and perhaps most misunderstood, figures. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps light an incense or two for that soothing fragrance. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The rhythm of life in the medieval world was often dictated by the turning of seasons, the rise and fall of the sun, and the subtle shifts in political winds. For Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, this rhythm was punctuated by a deeper, more profound cadence, that of survival, of vengeance, and of a relentless will forged in the fires of a tumultuous youth. This chapter delves into the quiet beginnings of a man whose name would echo through centuries, from his birth into a powerful lineage to the formative, often traumatic, years spent as a hostage of the formidable Ottoman Empire. These experiences, like persistent currents in a deep river, shaped his worldview, hardened his resolve, and cultivated the unique brand of brutal justice that would define his reign. Imagine a small, often beleaguered land nestled between titans. That was Wallachia in the 15th century, a principality caught in the relentless push and pull between the ambitions of the Hungarian kingdom to the west and the ever-expanding, formidable might of the Ottoman Empire to the east. This was the stage upon which the Drăculea dynasty, Vlad's ancestral line, played its intricate and often perilous game of power. Their existence was a constant negotiation, a delicate balance between alliances and betrayals, loyalty and pragmatism. The air itself seemed thick with the scent of damp earth and the lingering hint of wood smoke from distant hearths, a familiar comfort against the backdrop of constant unease. Vlad's father, Vlad II, bore the epithet Dracula, meaning the dragon. This wasn't a nickname born of ferocity, but a designation of honor. He was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a secret society of knights sworn to a sacred, perilous oath, to defend Christendom against the relentless advance of the Ottoman Turks. The symbol of the dragon, for them, was one of protective vigilance, a powerful emblem against the encroaching shadow. Thus, Vlad III inherited his formidable appellation, Drăculea, which simply meant son of the dragon. This name, innocent in its origin, signifying a legacy of defense, would later become synonymous with terror, an ironic twist of fate that history often weaves. The political climate into which Vlad was born was not merely volatile. It was a swirling maelstrom of shifting allegiances, assassinations, and constant external pressures. Wallachia, a fertile land, was a coveted prize, a strategic buffer, and a perpetual battleground. Its boyars, the powerful local nobility, were notorious for their fickle loyalties, often switching sides to benefit their own estates, weakening the ruling prince's authority. This constant internal strife, coupled with the external threats, meant that any ruler's hold on power was tenuous, often secured only through a precarious balance of force and fragile alliances. A rhythmic hum of uncertainty underpinned daily life, a constant awareness that the fortunes of their lord, and thus their own, could shift with the slightest political breeze. This inherent instability, a silent, pervasive hum beneath the surface of daily life, would become a defining constant throughout Vlad's entire existence. It was a world where trust was a fleeting commodity and power was often seized through swift, decisive, and often brutal action. The distant clatter of hooves over cobblestones might signify a visiting dignitary, or perhaps a raiding party, the sound carrying a quiet tension in the air. The year 1442 arrived, shrouded in a heavy air of political necessity and paternal sacrifice. To ensure his father's fragile loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan Murad II, Vlad, still a boy, along with his younger brother Radu the Handsome, was handed over as a royal hostage. Picture this: two young princes, plucked from the familiar, albeit turbulent, world of Wallachia and transported to the very heart of the formidable empire they were sworn to resist. The journey itself would have been a quiet, disorienting passage, moving from the forested valleys of Wallachia to the bustling, grand, yet alien courts of the Ottomans. This was not a life of abject suffering in a dark dungeon, as one might imagine from later myths. Instead, it was a complex, often subtly terrifying, political apprenticeship within the Sultan's court. Vlad was educated, learning the intricacies of the Turkish language, absorbing the nuances of Ottoman military strategy, and, most crucially, observing the raw, absolute power wielded by the Sultan himself. He witnessed firsthand the ruthless efficiency of a system that demanded unquestioning obedience and swiftly crushed dissent. He saw how power was not merely wielded, but meticulously enforced, often with chilling displays of authority. Imagine the quiet awe, and perhaps deep-seated fear, of a young boy watching the vast machinery of an empire operate, its justice swift and its punishments absolute. This period, though outwardly an education, was deeply transformative, a subtle but profound shaping of his very being. The constant hum of an unseen tension would have been a relentless companion, a quiet knowing awareness of his precarious position. The psychological impact of these years cannot be overstated. While he was not physically abused, the constant uncertainty, the knowledge of his precarious position as a pawn in a grand political game, and the ever-present threat of his father's perceived disloyalty would have etched deep lines upon his young mind. The whispers of court intrigue, the casual cruelty displayed towards disfavored officials, the sheer scale of the Sultan's power, all of these would have seeped into Vlad's consciousness, shaping his understanding of governance and survival. The eventual, brutal news would have solidified this internal landscape. The betrayal and murder of his father, Vlad II, and his older brother, Mircea, at the hands of treacherous Hungarian nobles, events that occurred while Vlad was still in Ottoman custody. This profound loss, coupled with the inherent powerlessness of his hostage status, solidified within him a deep-seated mistrust of external powers and a consuming thirst for vengeance against those who had wronged his family and, by extension, his land. It was a quiet trauma, one that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to erupt, a cold resolve slowly crystallizing within him. The frost chewed at his fingertips in the chill Ottoman nights, a physical echo of the coldness settling in his heart. The wheel of fortune, slow and deliberate, turned again for Vlad in 1448. He was returned to Wallachia, but not as a liberator. Instead, he was a puppet king, placed on the throne with the direct support of the Ottomans. His first reign was a brief, almost ephemeral flicker, a mere 2 months before he was deposed. This fleeting taste of power, and its swift withdrawal, served as a critical, if harsh, lesson. It hammered home the perilous nature of relying on external powers, a bitter understanding that true authority could not be borrowed, but had to be seized and held with an iron grip. It was a moment of quiet humiliation, a recognition that genuine sovereignty demanded an internal strength, a self-reliance he had yet to fully cultivate. The rhythm of his life, a constant struggle for control, was once again disrupted, forcing a retreat and a period of quiet reflection. For the next 8 years, Vlad was a wanderer, observing, learning, and patiently biding his time. He sought refuge in Moldavia and then Hungary, meticulously studying the political landscape, the weaknesses of his enemies, and the strategies of those who successfully held power. He honed his understanding of military tactics, immersing himself in the realities of warfare, preparing for the day he would reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. This period was not one of idleness, but of quiet calculation, of gathering strength and refining his brutal philosophy. Then, in 1456, the stage was set for Vlad's true return. This time, he came not with Ottoman backing, but with the cautious, strategic support of Hungary. The political winds had shifted, and Hungary, under the leadership of John Hunyadi, saw value in a strong, anti-Ottoman ruler in Wallachia. This second return was not brief, it was decisive. It cemented his position, finally allowing him to embark upon the 6-year reign that would forever etch his name into the annals of history. A reign characterized by a brutal clarity of purpose and a chillingly effective method of control. The boy who had been a hostage, then a pawn, had finally become the prince, ready to carve his legacy into the very fabric of Wallachia, a legacy that would leave a blood-soaked, yet undeniably compelling, mark on the world. His hands, always raw from travel and the subtle hardships of his wandering, now grasped the reins of power. His boots, often damp from dew or mud, now stood firmly on Wallachian soil. But the bread, when he finally held it, warm and nourishing at noon, tasted of the enduring hope of sovereignty. A day like any other, perhaps, in the grand sweep of history, but not quite. A day like any other, until the quiet, resolute prince took his throne. The quiet consolidation of power is often a gradual process, but for Vlad III, it was a swift, brutal ascension, a deliberate shaping of his realm through fear and an uncompromising sense of justice. Having reclaimed his throne, he moved with the chilling precision of a predator, his experiences as a hostage now informing every calculated decision. This chapter will delve into the infamous methods Vlad employed to establish absolute authority, enforce his unique brand of justice, and ultimately defend his kingdom against its relentless adversaries. We will analyze the historical context that permitted, and in some ways necessitated, his brutality, seeking to distinguish between the historical facts and the exaggerated tales that began to swirl around his name like the mists over the Wallachian Carpathians. The problem of the boyars, Wallachia's powerful local nobility, was a persistent thorn in the side of every Wallachian prince. These aristocratic families, with their vast estates and private armies, were notorious for their shifting allegiances, often playing Hungarian and Ottoman interests against each other, and, most perilously for any ruling prince, for assassinating rulers who did not align with their own ambitions. They represented a constant threat to any centralized power, a fragmented web of loyalties that undermined the stability of the principality. Vlad, having witnessed firsthand the treachery that led to the deaths of his father and elder brother, understood that this internal rot had to be excised with extreme prejudice. He knew that the very survival of his rule, and indeed, Wallachia itself, depended on breaking the boyars' power once and for all. The infamous incident known as the Easter Massacre stands as a chilling testament to Vlad's ruthless consolidation of power. In 1459, 2 years into his second reign, Vlad invited a large number of boyars and their families to a celebratory feast in Targovite, ostensibly to celebrate Easter. The air would have been thick with the scent of roasted meats and wine, the sounds of polite conversation masking the deadly intent that simmered beneath the surface. As the festivities reached their peak, Vlad revealed his true purpose. He accused the assembled boyars of past betrayals, including complicity in the death of his father and brother. What followed was a horrifying tableau of calculated cruelty. The older boyars, those whose loyalties were most suspect and whose influence was most entrenched, were immediately seized and impaled on sharpened stakes. The sounds would have been muffled by the thick walls, but the terror would have been palpable. The younger boyars, along with their families, were not granted the quick, agonizing release of impalement. Instead, they were rounded up and forced into a grueling, forced march to the ruins of Ponuri, a mountain fortress nestled high in the Carpathian foothills. This was not a leisurely journey. It was a brutal, relentless ordeal. Many perished along the way from exhaustion and starvation, their bodies left by the roadside as a silent warning. Those who survived were subjected to relentless forced labor, compelled to rebuild and expand the dilapidated fortress with their own hands. This monumental task, undertaken without proper tools or rest, claimed more lives. But for Vlad, it was a profound act of subjugation, a symbolic breaking of the boyar's spirit and power. This brutal act of revenge and consolidation established Vlad's authority in an undeniable, terrifying manner, ensuring that the remaining nobility would not dare to challenge his rule. The faint whispers of dissent were replaced by a quiet, enforced obedience. Impaling became Vlad's signature method of execution, an art of cruelty perfected to instill maximum terror. It was not merely a means to kill, but a horrifying public spectacle designed to deter crime and dissent, to send a clear, unequivocal message to both his subjects and his enemies. The process itself was agonizingly slow. A sharpened stake, often blunted to prolong suffering, was driven through the victim's body, avoiding vital organs if possible, so that death would come only after hours, or even days, of excruciating pain. These impaled bodies were often left on display, visible for all to see outside the walls of cities and towns, a chilling forest of the impaled serving as a permanent, gruesome warning. Chronicles from the period describe these macabre landscapes, the silent, upright figures serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of disloyalty or transgression. The most famous example of this terror tactic occurred in 1462, when an invading Ottoman army, led by Sultan Mehmed II himself, stumbled upon a horrifying sight outside Targovite, a vast forest of 20,000 impaled Turkish prisoners and Wallachian traitors. The sheer scale of the atrocity was intended to break the enemy's will, to fill them with a dread so profound that they would turn back. This display was not simply about killing. It was about psychological warfare on a grand, terrifying scale. It is from these historical accounts of brutality that the legend of Dracula began to take root. The primary sources of Vlad's infamous reputation were the German pamphlets that circulated rapidly across Europe in the late 15th century. These pamphlets, often illustrated with crude woodcuts depicting scenes of impalement and other atrocities, were a form of early propaganda. While they contained elements of truth, they were frequently exaggerated, designed to demonize Vlad and cement his image as a bloodthirsty tyrant. They served the political purposes of his enemies, particularly King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who used them to justify his eventual imprisonment of Vlad. However, a contrasting narrative emerged from the Slavic chronicles of the time. These accounts, often written by Orthodox monks, painted a more complex picture, often portraying Vlad not as a monster, but as a harsh but ultimately just ruler who brought order and stability to his chaotic land. For them, his extreme methods were necessary to combat the corruption of the boyars and to defend Wallachia against overwhelming external threats. He was seen as a protector, a strong hand guiding his people through perilous times, even if that hand was stained with blood. The Ottoman perspective, naturally, aligned more closely with the German accounts. For the Turks, Vlad was indeed a cruel monster, a narrative that served to demonize their enemy and justify their own campaigns against him. These differing accounts highlight the subjective nature of history, where the same actions can be interpreted wildly differently depending on the perspective of the observer. The distant cries of the dying, the silence of the forest, the warmth of a loyal hearth, all these sensations contributed to the tapestry of his reputation. Vlad's reign, therefore, was a tapestry woven with threads of brutal efficacy and a desperate struggle for survival. He was a product of his time, a ruler who understood that in a world of constant peril, a show of overwhelming, unwavering force was often the only path to stability and independence. The monster he became was in part a historical reality, shaped by a traumatic past and a ruthless present, and in part a creation of propaganda, a chilling whisper that grew into a shout across the centuries. His methods, though horrifying, were undeniably effective in achieving his goals of internal control and external deterrence, leaving a legacy that transcends simple definitions of good and evil. He was a force of nature, shaped by the raw power he observed, and now, wielding it himself. The quiet fear he inspired was a pervasive presence, settling like a thick fog over the Wallachian lands, ensuring a fragile, often brutal, peace. Beyond the terrifying shadow of the impaling stakes and the whispers of a monstrous cruelty, there lies another, equally compelling, facet of Vlad's reign: his unwavering, almost obsessive, role as a military leader and a bulwark against the colossal tide of the Ottoman Empire. For many in his time, and indeed for some even today, Vlad was not merely a tyrant but a fierce, unyielding defender of his homeland and, by extension, of Christendom itself. This chapter will gently shift our focus, moving from the internal consolidation of power to the external struggle for survival, examining his cunning military tactics and the singular, driving goal that defined his existence: the very survival of Wallachia. The simmering conflict with the Ottoman Empire found its immediate origins in a quiet act of defiance: Vlad's resolute refusal to continue paying the annual tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II. This was no mere fiscal dispute. It was a profound declaration of independence, a direct challenge to the authority of the conqueror of Constantinople himself. For centuries, Wallachia had endured as a vassal state, its princes often little more than pawns in the grand chess game played between the Ottomans and the European powers. Each year, the payment of this tribute was a grim reminder of Wallachia's subservient position, a heavy financial burden that also symbolized a loss of true sovereignty. Vlad, however, had observed the Ottomans from within, during his formative years as a hostage, learning their strengths and, crucially, their subtle weaknesses. He understood that true freedom could only be bought with blood, not with coin. He saw that continuous appeasement would only lead to eventual absorption, a slow, inevitable demise for his small principality. This refusal to pay tribute was an open invitation to war, a quiet challenge echoing across the Danube, a gauntlet thrown down before the mightiest empire of the age. The very air around Targovite, his capital, seemed to hum with a subtle tension, the quiet anticipation of the inevitable storm, a deep breath before the plunge into conflict. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, a desperate struggle against an enemy of vastly superior numbers and resources. Vlad's mastery of guerrilla tactics became legendary, a testament to his adaptability and profound understanding of his native land. He knew the dense forests, the winding rivers, and the treacherous mountain passes of Wallachia like the back of his hand, using them not as barriers to be overcome, but as allies in his desperate fight. His forces, often small and lightly equipped, would launch sudden, devastating surprise attacks on unsuspecting Ottoman patrols, ambushing lengthy supply convoys that stretched for miles, and then vanishing back into the protective embrace of the wilderness as quickly as they appeared. These hit-and-run raids were designed not for decisive victory in open battle, but to harass, demoralize, and deplete the enemy's resources. He employed scorched earth policies, a brutal but effective strategy to deny the invading army sustenance. Crops were systematically burned, villages evacuated of their inhabitants and their resources, and even wells were poisoned to render the land barren and weaken the Ottoman forces from within, leaving them without provisions in a hostile territory. The sounds of distant skirmishes, muffled by the dense tree cover, would be a constant, unsettling drumbeat for the Ottoman forces, a quiet torment gnawing at their resolve. The taste of dust and the constant knowing of hunger would press in on them, a subtle but relentless hardship that wore down even the most disciplined soldiers. This was not a war of grand battles on open fields, where the Ottomans' superior numbers and artillery would guarantee victory, but a war of attrition, of whispers in the night, of unseen dangers lurking behind every shadowed tree and across every silent plain. It was a rhythm of constant vigilance, of quiet movement through the landscape, a deliberate effort to exhaust and demoralize an overwhelming foe, turning Wallachia itself into a weapon against its invaders. The most famous, and perhaps most audacious, of Vlad's military endeavors was the night attack of 1462, an event that etched his name into the annals of military cunning. Sultan Mehmed II, exasperated by Vlad's persistent defiance and the losses incurred by his raiding parties, personally led a massive Ottoman army into Wallachia, an armada of soldiers intended to finally crush the rebellious prince and fully incorporate Wallachia into his empire. As the vast Ottoman camp, stretching for miles, settled for the night, a deceptive quiet fell over the land, broken only by the crackle of countless campfires and the murmur of thousands of tired men. But under the deep cloak of darkness, Vlad's forces, having meticulously planned and donned Turkish clothing to blend in, infiltrated the sprawling encampment. What ensued was a meticulously planned, yet chaotic, assault. Vlad's men targeted the Sultan's personal tent, creating mass confusion and panic within the heart of the enemy's command structure. Though Mehmed II himself narrowly escaped the immediate danger, the psychological impact of the attack was devastating. The Ottoman army, already demoralized by Vlad's relentless guerrilla tactics and the horrific sight of the forest of the Impaler they had encountered just days before outside Targovite, was thrown into utter disarray. The sudden, terrifying assault in the dead of night, combined with the chilling efficiency of Vlad's tactics, shattered their morale. This audacious act, a quiet whisper of terror in the heart of the enemy's camp, forced the Sultan to withdraw, a rare and humiliating defeat for the mighty Ottoman Empire and its conquering Sultan. The vast Ottoman encampment, once a symbol of overwhelming power, was now a scene of bewildered retreat, its grand ambition subtly thwarted by a smaller, but infinitely more cunning, force. This was a victory forged not in overwhelming strength, but in chilling audacity and an intimate understanding of his enemy's psychology, turning their numerical superiority into a vulnerability. Vlad's actions, despite their inherent cruelty, were widely perceived by many in Europe as a heroic defense of Christianity against the encroaching Muslim Ottoman infidels. In an era when the Ottoman Empire represented an existential threat to Christian Europe, steadily expanding its borders and threatening the very heart of the continent, a figure like Vlad, even with his brutal methods, was seen as a vital bulwark, a fierce, uncompromising barrier against expansion. He became a symbol of desperate resistance, a testament to the idea that even a small state could stand against a giant, if led by a sufficiently determined and ruthless hand. He received support, albeit often inconsistent and limited, from the Pope and other Christian rulers, who recognized his strategic importance on Europe's volatile eastern frontier. These alliances, though often fragile and motivated by self-interest rather than genuine admiration for Vlad's character, provided a quiet affirmation of his perceived role as a defender. Crusader calls were frequent in this period, and Vlad, regardless of his personal piety, was a practical instrument in that broader ideological conflict. The quiet hope in many European courts rested on such figures, even as they privately recoiled from their brutal methods, a subtle tension underlying their support. For many Romanians, even today, Vlad is not a monster to be feared, but a complex, enduring national hero, a leader who fought fiercely for the independence and survival of his nation against overwhelming odds. They view his ruthlessness as a necessary evil, a grim practicality born of desperate times and a fragmented political landscape. He brought order, however brutal, to a land plagued by internal strife and external aggression, creating a semblance of security where chaos had reigned. The legacy of a crusader against the Ottoman tide resonates deeply in the national consciousness, representing a time when Wallachia stood firm against overwhelming odds, a fierce determination to preserve its identity. The bitter cold of a Wallachian winter wind might have gnawed at his fingers, and the constant awareness of hunger pressed him during his campaigns, but the thought of a free Wallachia provided a warmth, an inner fire, that sustained him and drove his relentless actions. His was a grim, relentless rhythm, a constant struggle for sovereignty, mirroring the very breath of his people. That he was a figure who understood that sometimes, to preserve a nation, one must embrace the very darkness one seeks to fight. The quiet reflection on such a past offers a unique insight into the complexities of human choices under immense pressure, and how history itself can be shaped by the perspective of those who record it. He left behind a profound echo of a will that would not bend, a silent testament to the enduring power of resistance, even when wrought by the most fearsome hands, a name that would forever be synonymous with both terror and the fierce struggle for freedom. The reign of Vlad III, a period marked by both brutal order and fierce resistance, was not destined for a peaceful conclusion. Like the fleeting warmth of a summer day in the Carpathians, his time on the throne was intense, impactful, but ultimately, tragically short-lived. This chapter will delve into the circumstances surrounding Vlad's fall from power, his subsequent imprisonment, and his mysterious death, finally turning to the powerful and often contradictory legacy he left behind, a legacy that continues to resonate in history, literature, and the very cultural identity of a nation. The tide began to turn against Vlad in 1462, following his audacious, yet ultimately unsustainable, night attack against the Ottoman forces. While the attack forced Sultan Mehmed II to retreat, it did not decisively defeat him, nor did it fundamentally break the formidable power of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman war machine, vast, disciplined, and resilient, could absorb such shocks and continue its relentless advance, drawing upon seemingly inexhaustible manpower and resources from across its sprawling domains. Moreover, Vlad's relentless and often indiscriminate brutality, while undeniably effective in terrorizing his enemies and consolidating his internal power, also began to alienate his crucial, albeit often reluctant, allies. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who had previously offered Vlad cautious and conditional support, grew increasingly wary of the Wallachian prince's extreme methods, which sometimes bordered on fanaticism, and his unpredictable nature. Hungarian aid, which Vlad desperately needed to sustain his prolonged resistance against the Ottomans, became sporadic and unreliable, often driven more by Hungary's own fluctuating strategic interests and complex internal politics than by a genuine, consistent desire to prop up the Wallachian prince as an independent power. This lack of consistent external support, coupled with the sheer exhaustion of fighting a seemingly endless, total war against a superpower, began to chip away at Vlad's precarious position. Wallachia itself was being bled dry by the constant conflict, its meager resources depleted, its population weary of the unceasing demands of war, the forced conscriptions, and the harsh levies necessary to maintain Vlad's army. Whispers of discontent, long suppressed by fear of the Impaler's swift justice, began to circulate once more among the surviving boyars and even parts of the common populace, who had suffered immensely under his harsh rule and the relentless imposition of military obligations. The quiet hum of his absolute authority began to falter, replaced by a subtle tremor of instability, a growing sense that the iron grip was weakening, that the terrifying order he had imposed was becoming unsustainable. The sounds of distant Ottoman drums, once a call to arms, now perhaps carried a different, more ominous tone, suggesting an inescapable fate. The exact circumstances of Vlad's final overthrow are somewhat shrouded in the mist of historical ambiguity, contributing to the enduring mystique surrounding his life, but it is clear that he was betrayed and captured by Hungarian forces in late 1462. This was a calculated political maneuver orchestrated by King Matthias Corvinus. Matthias, facing pressure from the Pope to launch a new crusade against the Ottomans and seeking financial aid from Western powers, needed to present a credible front. However, he had no real desire to commit significant resources to Wallachia. By arresting Vlad, Matthias could simultaneously appease papal demands, by claiming to have neutralized a supposedly uncontrollable and overly brutal ally who was no longer useful, and deflect criticism for not actively engaging the Ottomans. Vlad was then brought to Hungary, where he was held prisoner for over a decade. This lengthy imprisonment, spanning roughly from 1462 to 1475, was not spent in a common dungeon, as one might imagine for such a fearsome figure. Instead, Vlad was kept under a form of house arrest, often in relative comfort, particularly in the royal fortress of Visegrad, and later in Buda. He was allowed to maintain a certain degree of princely decorum, receive visitors, correspond, and even, it is widely believed, father children during this time. He was also able to convert back to Catholicism, a pragmatic move that further improved his standing with his Hungarian captors. For a man of such restless energy, fierce will, and an unshakable belief in his divine right to rule, this enforced inactivity and confinement must have been a unique and profound form of torment. He was a caged dragon, his claws blunted, his fire banked, his immense drive frustrated, but never truly extinguished. His mind, accustomed to constant strategic calculation and brutal action, would have continued to churn, observing the political tides, biding its time, undoubtedly plotting his return. During these long years, Wallachia fell into a period of renewed instability, becoming a battleground for Ottoman and Hungarian influence, with various puppet rulers, including Vlad's own younger brother, Radu the Handsome, installed by the Ottomans, who sought to maintain control over the strategically vital principality. The chaotic rhythm of internal strife, which Vlad had so brutally suppressed during his effective reign, returned to his homeland with a vengeance, confirming his own harsh belief that only a strong, unwavering hand could truly govern Wallachia and protect it from foreign domination. Vlad's eventual release in 1475 was, once again, a matter of cold, calculated Hungarian strategic interest rather than any newfound benevolence or remorse. The Ottoman Empire was once more aggressively expanding its influence into the Balkans and threatening Hungarian borders directly, making Wallachia an increasingly critical buffer zone. King Matthias Corvinus, recognizing Vlad's proven military capabilities and his deep-seated hatred for the Turks, saw an opportune moment to utilize him. Still a formidable military figure despite his long imprisonment, and a sworn, unrelenting enemy of the Ottomans, Vlad was perceived as a valuable asset, a potential living weapon to be unleashed against their renewed advance. With renewed, albeit still limited and often conditional, Hungarian support, Vlad briefly regained the Wallachian throne in late 1476. His third reign, however, was tragically short-lived, a mere echo of his former power, lasting only a few tumultuous months. He faced immense challenges, a populace weary of war, an unstable boyar class, and a powerful Ottoman presence firmly entrenched. The details of his death are hotly debated among historians, further contributing to the enduring mystery surrounding his life and adding to the layers of legend that envelop his figure. Most accounts agree that he was killed in battle against the Ottomans and a coalition of Wallachian boyars who opposed him, likely in December 1476 or January 1477, near Bucharest. Some sources suggest he was ambushed by a small Ottoman raiding party, perhaps caught off guard while out on patrol. Others claim he was killed in open combat, heroically leading his men against overwhelming odds, perhaps even mistakenly by his own men in the confusion of battle, mistaking his Turkish attire, which he sometimes wore for stealth, for that of an enemy. There are also persistent theories, perhaps the most dramatic, that he may have been assassinated by his own treacherous boyars, who had suffered immensely under his previous reign and perhaps feared his return to absolute, unsparing power, seizing an opportune moment to finally rid themselves of their feared prince. His head, it is famously said, was then severed and sent to Constantinople as a grim trophy for Sultan Mehmed II, who reportedly displayed it on a stake to signify the complete eradication of his feared enemy, a final, chilling testament to Vlad's ultimate defiance and the end of a long, bitter struggle. The exact location of his burial remains unknown, though several sites have been proposed, such as Snago Monastery, adding yet another layer to the enigma of his final resting place, a silence that amplifies the mystery and allows for continued speculation. The last breath of cold Wallachian air on his face, the bitter taste of blood, the rhythmic clatter of distant hooves, these would have been the raw, visceral sensations of his final moments, a violent and ambiguous end for a life consumed by violence. The final act in Vlad's extraordinary, brutal, and ultimately tragic life was not played out on the battlefields of Wallachia, nor in the quiet confines of his Hungarian imprisonment, but in the atmospheric, gaslit corridors of Victorian literature. This final chapter will trace the profound, almost supernatural, transformation of Vlad the Impaler from a historical figure, a prince of flesh and blood who fought for the very survival of his nation, into the enduring literary icon of Dracula, the immortal vampire. We will explore the subtle threads and tantalizing sources that inspired Bram Stoker, the Irish novelist, and unravel how a ruthless medieval prince, known for his very real, physical cruelty, became a timeless symbol of horror that continues to cast a long, chilling shadow over global popular culture. The genesis of the Dracula myth, as we know it today, lies firmly with Bram Stoker's meticulous, if somewhat selective and interpretative, research in the late 19th century. Stoker, while deeply immersed in crafting his Gothic novel, stumbled upon a book on Wallachian history by William Wilkinson, an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, with various political observations relating to them, 1820. It was within these pages that he discovered the name Dracula, an ancient epithet for Vlad III. The name, with its resonant, almost guttural sound and its chilling dual association with Dracul, meaning both dragon, from the order of the dragon, and, more ominously, devil in some Wallachian dialects, immediately captivated his imagination. He learned of the historical Vlad's notorious reputation for extreme cruelty, his unwavering ruthlessness, and the fact that he hailed from a remote, mysterious land steeped in ancient superstition and vibrant folklore, particularly tales of vampires, strigo, evil spirits, and revenants prevalent in Eastern European peasant beliefs. Stoker was likely drawn to the powerful image of a dark, aristocratic figure from a wild, untamed corner of Europe. However, it is crucial to understand that Stoker's Dracula was not intended as a historical biography of Vlad III. He consciously took only the name, a few scattered and generalized details about Vlad's infamous brutality, such as his methods of punishment, and the evocative geographical setting of the Carpathian Mountains in Transylvania. The historical Vlad was a fierce warrior prince who fought for his people against the very real Ottoman Turks. Stoker's Dracula was an aristocratic, undead creature of the night, whose battles were eternal and against the living, his purpose to drain life, not to defend it. The quiet fascination with the grotesque, the macabre, and the allure of ancient evil found fertile ground in Stoker's imagination, marrying historical fact with folkloric dread in a potent brew. Stoker's Dracula was, in essence, a composite figure, a masterful tapestry woven from disparate threads of folklore, established literary conventions, and a dash of historical intrigue. The core concept of the vampire, a blood-drinking entity rising from the grave to prey on the living, was deeply rooted in various European myths and superstitions, particularly those of the Slavic and Balkan regions that were geographically close to Wallachia. These tales, often born from misunderstandings of death, disease, and the decay of bodies, provided a rich vein of terror. Stoker absorbed these widespread folkloric elements, combining them with the elegant, aristocratic villain archetype that was immensely popular in 19th century Gothic fiction, drawing on predecessors like Lord Riven or Varney the Vampire. The historical Vlad contributed the powerful, evocative name, Count Dracula, being far more striking than a more mundane moniker, and a certain underlying aura of ancient, brutal nobility, unwavering resolve, and a chilling, almost superhuman, will. Stoker's genius lay not in historical accuracy, but in his unparalleled ability to fuse these diverse elements into a single, terrifying, and compelling antagonist that tapped into deep-seated Victorian anxieties about foreignness, sexuality, and the unknown. The novel, published in 1897, became an immediate sensation, its dark themes and thrilling narrative captivating readers. It propelled the name Dracula, and by extension a distorted, sensationalized image of Vlad the Impaler into the global consciousness, forever linking the historical prince with the supernatural horror of the undead. The subtle rustle of pages in a quiet study, the flickering gaslight, the faint smell of old paper. These were the quiet sensations that gave birth to a legend that would roar across generations and influence countless works of fiction. The modern legacy of Vlad the Impaler is therefore a fascinating and often contradictory one, a testament to the power of narrative over raw fact. To the vast majority of the Western world, the myth of Dracula has so completely eclipsed the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler that they are almost indistinguishable. Vlad is now primarily recognized as the vampire king, a symbol of horror, a ubiquitous Halloween costume, and the subject of countless films, books, and television shows that further detach him from his historical reality, reducing his complex life to a single, monstrous archetype. The quiet fear he once inspired on the battlefields of Wallachia, a tangible dread of a ruthless ruler, has transformed into a marketable, albeit still potent, pop culture phenomenon, a source of entertainment rather than existential threat. Yet, this broad Western perception stands in stark contrast to how Vlad is often viewed in his native Romania, particularly within Wallachia, the land he governed. There, he remains a complex but ultimately heroic figure, a symbol of national pride and fierce resistance. Romanians often emphasize his role as a strong, uncompromising leader who brought order and relative peace to a chaotic land, severely punishing corruption and crime, and, most importantly, as a defender against the vastly superior Ottoman Empire. They see his brutality not as inherent evil, but as a grim necessity, a pragmatic tool employed in a desperate fight for survival and sovereignty against overwhelming odds, a reflection of the harsh realities of 15th century geopolitics. The quiet, resolute pride in their historical defender offers a unique and important counter-narrative to the global Gothic myth, reminding us that heroes and villains are often defined by the perspective of the storyteller. The timeless fascination with Vlad's story, whether through the lens of history or horror, lies in its potent exploration of universal themes: power, fate, justice, however brutal, and the enduring human struggle against overwhelming odds. He is a powerful, almost archetypal, reminder that history's most terrifying villains are often complex individuals forged by brutal circumstances, and that the line between a hero and a monster is often profoundly blurred by cultural narratives, political propaganda, and the relentless, shaping passage of time. His story invites us to consider the difficult choices made under extreme duress, the moral ambiguities of leadership in times of crisis, and the profound ways in which a historical figure's actions can be reinterpreted, embellished, and reimagined to serve entirely different cultural narratives and societal needs across centuries. The quiet echo of his name, whether whispered in fear of the supernatural or spoken with fierce pride in a national past, continues to resonate through the centuries, a testament to a life lived on the razor's edge between stark, brutal survival and timeless, terrifying legend. These were the rhythms of the world he inhabited, and in which his formidable, unforgettable legend was forged, a silent, powerful presence that continues to haunt and fascinate both historians and lovers of horror alike.